Do you ever wish you had a more positive attitude? Well, the mistake most people make when they're trying to cultivate a better attitude is that they treat it like a knowledge problem. Once I read this book on growth mindset, then I'll have a more confident, positive attitude toward life. Or once my therapist helps me process my anxious attachment with my mother, then I'll be able to have a positive, constructive attitude toward life. But that's not how attitude works. Attitude is your mind's tendency to think in a certain way, and it's the result of behavior, not insight, which means changing your attitude is about doing things differently, not collecting more insights. Hi, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and mindset coach, and today I'm going to talk to you about 3 of my favorite strategies for actually improving your mindset and creating a healthier, more positive attitude. Number 1, set yourself a zero tolerance policy on complaining. We all complain, mostly because it feels good. If I complain about something being bad, it makes me feel good by comparison because I'm the one who sees it. In other words, it's kind of an ego boost. And I found this is especially true for people like me who like to think of themselves as not much of a complainer. Unfortunately, the habit of complaining generates a lot of negativity, which makes sense if you think about it. If you're constantly thinking about problems and how bad things are, you're going to eventually start seeing problems everywhere. This is an attentional bias. You're training your attention to see and notice the negative. And if that happens on a regular basis, we shouldn't be surprised when our overall attitude starts to become pretty negative. Now, setting yourself a zero tolerance policy on complaining might seem a tad unrealistic, which is true. You will definitely fail to live up to this zero tolerance policy on complaining. I have tried multiple times to set myself this goal of not complaining at all, and I always fail miserably. But such a strict policy is still really helpful even if you don't succeed, because it's going to help you do 2 very specific things which will improve your overall attitude. First, it will increase your awareness of the habit of complaining. And like with any sort of change or growth project, awareness is always the first step. It's a little bit painful to realize how frequently you complain, but it's essential if you actually want to start improving this. 2, it will create more space in that decisive moment when you feel tempted to complain, either out loud or in your own head, and increase your odds of being able to inhibit that complaining and shift onto something more productive instead. Now remember, the goal here is not to eradicate complaining entirely, even if that was something you want to do. It's just not going to be possible. But even a 10 to 20% reduction in the amount of overall complaining you do, that's going to create a significant shift in attitude toward the positive and away from the negative. So here's a really simple way to get started. Open up your phone and open up the Notes app in your phone and create a notes file called complaints or complaining. Then, whenever you notice yourself complaining or even just feel the urge to complain, quickly open up your phone and jot down what was the trigger and what was the actual complaint. Now, do this for a week or 2, and you're going to start to notice some really obvious patterns about when and where you tend to complain most. And once you get more specific about where your habit of complaining shows up, your odds of being able to address that and do less of it go way up. Okay? And when you do that, your overall attitude tends to improve. Number 2, limit your news consumption to once per week. The news is deliberately biased toward the negative because it leads to more attention from us, the consumer, which then leads to more ad sales, which means that the companies who own the organizations that do the news drive a lot more revenue. And this is true, by the way, almost regardless of the source of news, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or even the Joe Rogan podcast. So much of the news is ultimately driven by ad sales. And those ad sales are driven by making us really negative. In particular, afraid or scared, and angry or outraged. So, a relatively easy way to dramatically cut down on the amount of negativity in your life, and as a result, allow your natural positivity to shine through more, is to cut down on the quantity of news you consume. So, here's a strange but really strong recommendation that I would give to all of you. Try this as an experiment, just for a week or 2. Just try it. Doesn't have to be your whole life. Just give it a shot. And here's what it is. Limit your consumption of news to a 1 to 2 hour stretch of time once per week. So maybe, on Saturday mornings from 10 to 11:30, you sit down with a couple cups of coffee and you read the newspaper. Or maybe it's on Friday evening, You have queued up all the articles that you want to read, and that's when you scroll through on your tablet on the couch in the evening, and that's when you do your news. So find a time and put all your news into one bucket and do it then. Now, this might sound kind of shocking, and if it does, I would just ask you to reflect on one pretty simple question. Does anyone benefit from me being plugged into the news on a daily, much less hourly basis? I think you're going to find that even after just a week or two of doing this little experiment, you're not any less informed, and your attitude is remarkably more positive and less negative. Number 3, build agency with micro-assertiveness. A lot of negativity stems from unaddressed resentment. Here are a few examples of what I mean by that. Let's say you frequently find yourself gossiping about the state of your company because you resent the founder and CEO for the way she runs it. Or you find yourself catastrophizing about the state of the nation because ultimately you resent half the population who voted in a different way than you did. Or occasionally you find yourself envying your sister-in-law because she has an amazing career that she loves in the very field that you wanted to go into but didn't. Maybe you even find yourself falling into spirals of self-criticism and judgment because you resent yourself for not following through on your own dreams, goals, and aspirations. See, all these forms of negativity, from gossiping and catastrophizing to envy and even self-criticism, these negative thought patterns are the raw material that goes into having a negative attitude. And if many of them are based in a core underlying resentment, that means you can actually pretty quickly improve the overall quality of your attitude by addressing that underlying resentment. So how do you do this exactly? How do you address underlying resentment? Sounds really tough and gnarly and complicated, right? Sometimes, but I have found that most people struggle with resentment because they're not actually thinking about it correctly. And what I mean by that is, in my experience, resentment is almost always about your own lack of agency. In other words, on some very core level, you feel helpless or out of control in the face of negative things in your life. And you resent yourself for not being more proactive about addressing those things. But because it's very emotionally painful to admit that we resent ourselves, we end up deflecting that resentment onto other people. So using our examples from above, if you resent your sister-in-law for her amazing career, deep down, that's probably a manifestation of your own self-resentment for not going after that career you really wanted to. Or if you resent half the country for voting in a different way than you did, that could be because deep down, you resent yourself for not being more politically proactive and involved like you feel you should be, volunteering, educating, organizing, that sort of thing. The solution to self-resentment and all the negativity that it generates is to build more agency. Agency is the belief in your ability to positively influence yourself or the world around you. And when you have a high agency mindset, you tend to be very proactive about going after what you want rather than complaining or feeling resentful about what you don't have or what you don't want or what you don't like. And while there are a ton of factors that go into whether someone has a high agency mindset or not, a very simple but powerful way to start to cultivate a higher agency mindset is by communicating more assertively. Of course, assertive communication, it's a big topic. There's a lot of moving pieces in it, and it can be fairly challenging. So I recommend starting with what I call micro-assertiveness, which just means looking for very small, doable examples of places where you can practice just being a little bit more assertive in your life. You know, asking at a restaurant to be reseated to a better location in the restaurant. It might mean, telling your partner at work on a work project that you actually disagree with his assessment of how things are going and stating what you really think. It might be telling your partner that even though you know he doesn't love Thai food, you want to get Thai food for dinner tonight instead of Italian, like he suggested. So these ideas like becoming more assertive and building a high agency mindset, they can seem intimidating and overwhelming, but that's only if you're only thinking about the really hard, big, epic version of it. And while that's important, you may well want to get there eventually. Start with the very small, tiny versions of them, right? And then slowly but surely work your way up. So here's how this all works. Communicating assertively will foster more agency. And having more agency will lead to less resentment. And less resentment will allow your naturally positive attitude to shine through. Now, if the idea of starting to communicate more assertively in order to build more agency, even in small ways. If that seems intimidating, I totally get it. I talk and teach and coach about this stuff all the time. So I get how hard it can be and how many unusual obstacles we can all have because of the details of our own particular lives. So I created this little checklist. I call it the Assertive Communication Cheat Sheet. And it's just a simple little 4 or 5 page PDF document that lists the most important principles when it comes to communicating assertively, and like the things I would remind my own clients if they were going to go try and be more assertive in their communication. So I created that little checklist, and you are more than happy to download a copy of it for free. I put a link to be able to get it in the description below. All right, if you enjoyed this video, I've got another one that I think you'll really like. It's called 3 Ways to Stop Bad Moods.